And so you've installed the regulator into your air reservoir and you're very happy and confident with the work that you've carried out here. You've set yourself the goal, as I've asked you to, with the number of shots you wish to achieve and the energy or power level in foot-pounds or joules of this string of shots. And so you've filled the gun with air and done your first graph. Now let's imagine that you've either A, got slightly more power than you would wish for and less shots, or B, slightly less power than you would have wished for and more shots. And so when we're talking about slightly, I'll say a figure of between 20 and 35 feet a second, either more or less. This sort of parameter is the parameter of adjustment that's normally in an unregulated air rifle. It's built in by the manufacturers so they can set the gun up when it's unregulated. So as we've already discussed, you might have a hammer that's adjustable in length, a hammer spring which can be compressed or decompressed to adjust its compression and force firing the hammer forwards, an adjustable screw on the transfer port to cause a restriction, and some guns have an adjuster or packers on the outlet valve spring. And so there'll be some adjustment built in by the manufacturer so that he can adjust the power to where it's supposed to be when it's unregulated. So if your graph is slightly over power or slightly under power, you should be able to just use these simple adjustments to achieve what you wish. So the last thing that you want to be doing, and I'll say that again, the last thing that you want to be doing at this stage is adjusting the pressure of the regulator itself. I think people tend to think that the power is to do with the regulator. It is in a way, but very little. Most of the adjustment is in this section of the gun, and so I'll explain why. Firstly, you mustn't touch the regulator. Okay, so this is why you shouldn't adjust the regulator for small power adjustments. When your gun is unregulated and you fill the reservoir to 3,000 pounds per square inch, there's going to be a great deal of force pressing the outlet valve shut. Far more force than the outlet valve spring applies. Off the top of my head, without doing any calculations, I think if you've got a piston of about 5mm diameter and 3,000 pounds per square inch of pressure, that's enough to lift an 80kg weight off the floor. So if your valve head is 6 to 7mm, even if you've only got 100 bar, 85, 100 bar coming through the regulator, the amount of force pressing the outlet valve shut is immense. And so that is why you shouldn't adjust the regulator. So we'll pretend that this regulator is set at 100 bar. You've got 35 feet per second more power than you want. And so what do? You think, I know what's the matter. I'll adjust the regulator. And you adjust the adjustment screw and you drop the pressure on the regulator by 10 bar and drop it to 90 bar. In doing that, you've reduced the force keeping the outlet valve shut by 10%. This means that the hammer hits the end of the outlet valve and finds it far easier to knock the valve open because there's a lot less force. And instead of you getting less power, which you would have hoped, you get exactly the opposite. All of a sudden, you've got far more power than you wanted. And this confuses you because you've actually turned the pressure on the regulator down. So do not adjust the regulator. As I've already said, there should be enough adjustment in the outlet valve mechanism area with the hammer, the transfer port, to simply reduce the power down by 35 feet a second. Normally this would be to back off or loosen or slacken off the hammer spring, so reduce the compression on that by winding the screw out. That would be the first way. If you've got a gun where you can adjust the hammer length, you would make the hammer travel shorter, so you'd make the hammer slightly longer so it fires forwards only say 4mm instead of 6. Or you could wind in the transfer port adjustment screw, so you could wind that in, restrict the port, and that would drop the power of the gun down and give you the extra shots that you wished for. So use the adjustments of the hammer spring firstly, or the transfer port, or the hammer travel distance. Don't wind the pressure down on the regulator, because it'll put the power up as opposed to putting the power down. Adversely to that, but in exactly the same way, if the power is less than what you would have hoped for, again, don't adjust the regulator by putting the pressure up. That puts more force onto the outlet valve, and the pressure and the output energy level will drop even lower than what you'd already got. So in that case, wind the hammer spring in, or make the hammer travel longer, or open up the screw on the adjustment on the transfer port a little bit. Try to avoid being tempted to adjust the regulator. Please use these adjustments if you've got between 0 and 35 feet per second higher or lower than you require. Use those adjustments first. Now, if you've got a gun that's fairly fixed and static, and there is one or two guns about that haven't got adjustable hammer spring compression or travel, then the best thing to use is just to find or make some simple packers that you can put inside the hammer to compress the spring, or something that you can slide over the spring guide just so as to compress the spring more, to give it more wallop to fire the hammer forward. So just standard household washers that you get from a hardware store, any old spacers that you might have laying around. Obviously if you've got a lathe, and you can custom make one to exactly the right length once you've played about, that's the best way. But otherwise you can just use some standard household type washers, or rubber discs or plastic discs, just to pack out the hammer spring to give it a bit more punch, to put the power up